Good day, everyone. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, everyone. Our program will begin in just a moment. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, Israel at War, a series featuring programs surrounding the evolving situation in Israel and the region, understanding the impact around the world and sharing action items you can take from wherever you are. The IDF and Israel Security Agency announced today that another hostage taken during the October 7th terrorist attack has been rescued as part of the IDF's daring and courageous operations deep inside of Gaza. This marks a rare moment of relief during what has been a very challenging year for Israel. May all the hostages safely return home to their loved ones. This past weekend, however, Hezbollah planned a surprise attack on Israel following the targeted killing of a top commander. Despite Israel's preemptive strikes, Hezbollah fired more than 300 rockets at Israel. And joining us today on the ground in Israel to discuss the current state of affairs is AJC Jerusalem Director Lt. Colonel Reserve Avital Leibovich. She'll be in conversation with AJC's Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer Jason Isaacson. After we hear from Jason and Avital, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Jason, Avital, floor is yours.
Daniel, thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. As Daniel said, we convened this webinar to learn more about the intense exchange of fire over the weekend between Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed terror organization embedded in Lebanon, and Israel, and to examine how that ongoing conflict fits into the wider picture of the threats facing Israel on multiple fronts, and the even broader threats to regional peace and stability posed by Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies. But before we dive into this, let's take a moment, as Daniel just suggested, to discuss the latest news in just the last couple of hours of the liberation by Israeli forces of one of the hostages who'd been held by the terror organization Hamas in Gaza. Avital, please share what you know about this dramatic development.
So many details will still be exposed in the next couple of hours, and I'll explain in a minute why. But something like 2.5 hours ago, this is the afternoon here in Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces, together with the Secret Services, the Shabak, revealed that they freed a hostage, a 53-year-old man, a Muslim, Israeli, Bedouin, Farhan. He's a guy who worked on October 7th in a warehouse in a kibbutz on the envelope of Gaza and was kidnapped from this warehouse. At home, he left 11 children. The youngest at the time was 2 months old. It was a very courageous operation, a few different units combined together, including special forces. He was found in a state of malnutrition, although walking on his own feet in a tunnel in southern Gaza. He was alone. We know he was alone without any other hostages around him. And we also know that the people who guarded him, Hamas terrorists who were surrounding him and guarding him in the tunnel, ran away when they heard that the Israeli army is approaching. So very good news. I can tell you in the last couple of hours, he was flown to Soroka Hospital in Beersheba. His family, which is a big clan in the city of Rahat, it's the biggest Bedouin city in southern Israel. A huge amount of people from his family came over to the hospital. The doctors actually allowed an entrance of 2 or 3 people at a time, just, to let him adjust to the situation. The initial tests that the hospital ran turned out with good results, so more reason to be optimistic. This is the 8th hostage that the IDF is releasing in heroic operations all across Gaza since the war began. And of course, there were situations where bodies were retrieved as well. However, with all this optimism, and there's a lot of optimism, there's still a lot of concern. What will the next day bring? I can tell you that there are constant talks in Cairo, in other capitals, with negotiating teams on different levels, senior and work levels, in order to try and maintain the momentum of the talks to a possible hostage deal.
And there is still more than 100 hostages being held, alive and dead.
Right.
Isn't that right?
There is 108 hostages being held. The youngest one is a toddler who's 1 year old, and the oldest is an 86-year-old man. Of course, there are women there. There are female soldiers there. They're spread all over Gaza. Hamas is the main organization holding those hostages, but there are 3 small organizations also holding some of the hostages. And we're talking about a period of 326 days that these people are being held, many of them underground in dark tunnels with no oxygen, no electricity, minimal food. By the way, the hostage that was released today, Farhan, said that his main diet, his main food consisted of a little bit of bread. And I looked at the picture of Farhan a year ago, and I looked at the picture today coming out of the tunnel. You can really tell that Farhan lost dozens of kilograms from his weight because he was really malnutritioned.
Well, a rare bit of good news in a very difficult situation. Thank you, Avital. So let's return to the topic that we were going to be focused on in this conversation. Before dawn on Sunday morning, Israeli military intelligence determined that Hezbollah was preparing to launch a large-scale missile attack on Israel, prompting the military command to take defensive preemptive action, dispatching waves of jet fighters to strike dozens of Hezbollah missile launching sites across a swath of Lebanon, eliminating what were reported to have been thousands of missiles. Hezbollah then responded with a barrage of missiles and drones fired into Israel, nearly all of those missiles and drones intercepted. It was all over by the time most people woke up in Israel and in Lebanon on Sunday morning, but whether the exchange of attacks between the Iranian-backed terrorist organization Hezbollah and the state of Israel was really over or just taking a pause remains to be seen. So let's begin there. Avital, please remind our viewers how we got to the point that hundreds of missiles can almost routinely be fired into Israeli territory, and it doesn't trigger an all-out war. What prompted this latest exchange, and what's likely to end this months-long cycle of deadly strike and counterstrike between Hezbollah and the IDF?
Thank you, Jason. So in order to answer your question, we need for a minute to go back and look at the multiple fronts that Israel has been dealing with. So Israel attacked the oil refineries in the Hodeidah port in Yemen a few weeks ago. Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, was killed in Tehran in a Revolutionary Guards compound a few weeks ago. Israel did not take official responsibility for that. It did so for Yemen. And Fuad Shukr, who was the right hand of Hassan Nasrallah, he was the chief of staff of Hezbollah, was killed, and Israel took official responsibility for that in the Dahya neighborhood. This is really a Hezbollah stronghold in the southern part of Beirut. And all these 3 situations, which were quite dramatic, each of them separately, let alone all of the 3 together, led to some kind of very high tension here in Israel. And also assessments and thinking whether these 3 fronts will unite and there will be one massive kind of retaliation, or there will be some sort of individual kind of retaliations, each front in the time that will see fit. And what we have seen actually was Sunday morning. I have to say that I woke up, I was waken up by a phone call I got from my reserve military base describing the situation. And here is what I can share with you. Israel had very good intelligence information that Hezbollah is planning to launch an attack towards mainly the northern part of Israel, but not only, also some strategic bases well inside Israel, more in the central part. According to the intelligence, the estimation was that Hezbollah will fire something like 500 rockets and a few dozens of drones. Now, the attack that Hezbollah planned was for 5:15 a.m. on Sunday. The Israeli Defense Forces launched a preemptive strike, and it's only a preemptive strike, and then I'll talk about the meaning of this, at 4:40 a.m. So 35 minutes before Hezbollah's plan. The main tool were fighter jets, which simultaneously in 3 waves of attack targeted something like 6,000 altogether in all the 3 waves, 6,000 launchers and rockets. Now, if you were here, Jason, at 5 o'clock in the morning, you would hear a huge noise of jets in the air because 100 jets flying above your head can make a lot of noise. A lot of Israelis just woke up because of the noise. Now, 3 waves of attack. Hezbollah obviously was very, very much surprised. And Israel did actually prove that it has very good intelligence. And you know what? Maybe it also built a little bit of its deterrence that was lost a few years ago. Now, eventually, what Hezbollah was able to do in such a situation is to fire something like 240 rockets. And I know the numbers Hezbollah gave later officially were higher, but it's fake. And 20 drones. I have to say that we had one tragic incident in which a Navy soldier, a 21-year-old Navy soldier, who was in a military vessel near Nahariya beaches, was killed. It's not clear whether he was killed by shrapnel of an Iron Dome interceptor or something else, but this is the unfortunate outcome from the Israeli perspective. I can say that there was a lot of damage to homes. We can talk later about the civilian aspect, but there were a lot of damage to Israeli homes, primarily in the Western Galilee. Now, we've been hearing from the first minute the Hezbollah story. And actually, they needed to sell their retaliation as some sort of a successful kind of move. Now, which way would they do that? And here, what we saw, unbelievable set of lies. Number one, exaggerating and blowing up the numbers of the rockets that they fired. Number two, Nasrallah, in a speech he gave later that day, actually pointed to 2 Israeli bases, one in Herzliya and the other one half an hour north of Herzliya. And he said, without, blinking for a second, that they were able to hit the strategic sites. And of course, this is fake. They were not even close, not to this base and not to another base. But in his speech, he said 2 very interesting things. Number one, Nasrallah said that Hezbollah's decision was to act alone. Now, I do want to say something about that. The date they chose had a religious significance. It's not for no reason that they chose specifically Sunday, because this is a day of indication which is equivalent to the 40th day to the death of the Imam Hussein ben Ali ben Abi Talib in the Karbala battle. This is one of the most crucial ideological events for the Shiite community. And in this day, there are dozens of demonstrations and different kinds of marches with hundreds of thousands of Shiites from all over the world who are coming to visit the grave of Hussein in Karbala. Now, the meaning of choosing this specific date is actually saying that, this is the resistant movement against Israel. The Shiites from all over the world are joining together. So there was logic to this date. The second thing he said, which I found interesting, was the following. They will look into the results of their attack towards Israel, those 240 rockets and 20 drones. And if it will be satisfactory from their perspective, then they would consider it as an appropriate retaliation for the death of Shukr. In other words, from these 2 things, we can understand that Hezbollah was looking for a way to come down the tree, to climb down the tree, and that's exactly what they did. I do want to say that this does not change in any way the strategic situation in the north, because the next morning, people of Israel woke up, and again, it was some kind of 8 attacks per day, which Hezbollah again is firing towards Israeli communities. Those 60,000 people are still evacuated, so it did not have any strategic effect on the situation at the end of the day. And last thing I want to share with you is that it seems maybe because the media maybe lost interest a little bit of what's going on here, and probably not in the north, it's in the south. It seems like that there is peaks from time to time, but most of the time it's quiet. But I do want to fix that impression with your permission and say that in the last week, the number of attacks that Hezbollah had in Israel was 72. 72 attacks. Now, an attack could be 100 rockets, an attack could be 20 drones. So it's not a situation as if, it's quiet and stable with a peak like that or not. But as I said, this does not change the strategic situation. And of course, the alert here in Israel remains high, especially the border, but not only.
And is the number of missiles that have been fired into Israel since October 8th something like 7,500? Is that what I saw?
I would say even it crossed the 8,000.
Oof.
And of course, when we say missiles, it's a generic term, but
Yeah.
there are different kinds of missiles, and Hezbollah in the last 18 years was able to build its military power. And there are some missiles which are accurate. There are some rockets which have a bigger warhead of hundreds of kilograms. And of course, the drone industry, which began in 2009 and developed, we see what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, but we see it in other places in the world. It's an industry that it's a high-tech really industry that developed. And this also has a lot of capabilities. I'm not talking about surveillance. I'm primarily talking about the attack drones. And Hezbollah is also taking advantage of the different tools that it built in order to really create this situation of attrition with Israel.
So let's talk about what's happening in the north of Israel, the impact on the Israeli public, which you've just been referencing. School is beginning next week, as I understand it. There are tens of thousands of residents in the north who have been forcibly displaced from their homes for the last 10 months, more than 10 months. Are they beginning to return to their homes, or with the situation still so unresolved, so tenuous, so precarious? Are they now going to stay in their new temporary residences for, indefinitely?
Yeah, this is really a painful situation. We're talking about 63,000 more or less residents of the north who left their homes the second week of October and have not returned since. Now, when you're older and you don't have little kids, you have less burden on your shoulders. But when you have little kids and you have to remove them from one educational system to another, and they have to meet a new group of friends, a new group of teachers, and the supportive environment has changed a million times, then this is very, very problematic. Now, unfortunately, I can tell you that in these almost 11 months, almost 12 months, we have seen huge damage to the infrastructure in many communities in the north. The town of Metula, which is the northern town, there is a big percentage of houses that have been damaged. Kiryat Shmona as well. Manara, it's another kibbutz in the Eastern Galilee, Shlomi, and others. So the houses are, of course, left empty. In many of the houses, there is still the sukkah from the holiday of Sukkot, because that's when the attack began. And unfortunately, what I'm hearing from the mayors of these communities is that a big percentage of the people do not want to return, around 40%. Because what they're saying is that, of course, they admire, the preemptive strike we just discussed, but this still does not change the fact that Hezbollah still has more than 120,000 rockets. They still have the special force, the Radwan force, which is on the border, ready to infiltrate. And they still have all these capabilities, plus their allies in Syria, in Iran, in Yemen, in Iraq. So people are very, very reluctant to return to their homes. So no, September 1st, unfortunately, will not open in those communities. The people will have to send their children to study in different schools, not on the border area, not within 9 kilometers from the border. The situation in the south, it's the same. I will say, though, that in Lebanon, in South Lebanon, I see also huge numbers of people which evacuated. Something like 104,000 Lebanese evacuated from Lebanon. And even in the Dahya neighborhood where Hezbollah is, a lot of people left their apartments and are looking to rent elsewhere. So obviously my concern is with the Israelis, but definitely both countries are paying a very heavy price in terms of economy, but also the mental capabilities and well-being of the people, and this is really, really tragic.
So the U.S. administration under with the work of Amos Hochstein, a special envoy of President Biden, and French officials as well, have been trying for several months to negotiate some kind of a diplomatic solution, or temporary solution at least, semi-permanent solution, to push Hezbollah back from the border, to ease tensions, to allow people to return to their homes on both sides of the border. Is there any hope that a diplomatic solution could resolve this, or are we just doomed to constant cross-border exchanges of fire and people permanently displaced? What's the possibility for the future?
The possibility is not very optimistic. And I want to share with the viewers the two UN resolutions which are relevant to the question you're asking me, really. The first one is the UN resolution 1559. This was adopted on September 2nd, 2004. What it really says is that it supports free and fair presidential elections in Lebanon, which do not exist, of course, urging the Lebanese government to establish control over its territory, disarm militias like Hezbollah, and facilitate the withdrawal of any remaining foreign forces from the country. That was in 2004. 2 years later, in 2006, actually August 11, 2006, UN Resolution 1701 was adopted. And due to the failure of the previous resolution, which I just read, it basically said that the border area between Israel and Lebanon should be controlled by the Lebanese armed forces and not by any militias, Amal, Islamic Jihad, Hamas in Lebanon, or Hezbollah. And of course, Hezbollah is the main force. Now, this lasted a few months until it actually evaporated in thin air. And ever since, for the last 18 years, we are seeing different formats and different kind of creativity of Hezbollah on the border. Sometimes they dressed up as forest keepers with special T-shirts, with a special logo, as if they are, you know, they care about the environment. Other times they just don't bother and they walk around with their uniform. And basically the discussions which Amos is leading, as well as the French envoy and the German envoy, have to do with some kind of return to some kind of a format of UN Resolution 1701. Now, Hezbollah, when it was built primarily in South Lebanon, because that's a stronghold of the Shiite population. When I say it was built, I refer to the fact that it dug tunnels, it built storages, it actually included positions, outposts, and bases, and war rooms. So the majority of the arsenal, at least for the first 20 years, was concentrated there. What would be the incentive for Hezbollah to say, we'll leave it there, we'll go north of the Litani River, we'll leave our weapons there unattended and the tunnels unattended, and we'll go along with the agreement. So I don't really see an incentive for Hezbollah to do that. And from the Israeli civilians' perspective, those who live on the border, what is the meaning of 8 kilometers? Let's say a miracle happens and the agreement, understanding, contract is being signed and agreed upon, and they move 8 kilometers from there. The missiles that they have can cover all of Israel. So that still will not give an ultimate sense of protection. What it will give, the only thing it will give is some sort of a delay. So the Israeli intelligence will be able to detect and have a little bit more time to respond because it's 8 kilometers. But 8 kilometers, let's keep in mind, it's 5 minutes on a motorcycle. So I'm not optimistic. I mean, of course, everybody prefers here to settle, not everybody, but the big majority of the population prefers to settle the situation with an agreement, but I'm not sure it's realistic.
To what degree is the tension in the north, the exchanges of fire between Hezbollah and the IDF, linked to what's happening in Gaza? To what degree is there a possibility that if there is a ceasefire deal, hostages are released, Hamas is no longer in control, the situation is stable there, that calms the situation in the north? Or are they really not so dependent on each other?
Look, it's linked and it's also not linked, and I'll explain. It's linked because from October 8th, which was the first day which Hezbollah fired rockets towards Israel independently without any Israeli trigger, since that day, Nasrallah said repeatedly that the first minute there will be a ceasefire in Gaza, they will hold their fire. So it's connected to that sense. However, let's say that we have an agreement and there's a ceasefire. Still, what do we do with 150,000 rockets and thousands of drones and the Iranian chain of money going in and building and continuing to train Hezbollah? And then what do we do with the situation in Syria, which has become a no man's land after 2018 and the civil war there that broke out and the fragmentation of the country? By the way, Lebanon too is in a terrible economic shape and they don't have electricity most of the day and so on. So these are fertile grounds for just strengthening of these terror groups, especially Hezbollah. So it's linked in that sense, but it's also not linked because we need to solve it somehow. So of course, preferably will be with an agreement. But again, this is not a country versus a country. And one of the examples I can give you is that when those 12 kids were killed by a Hezbollah rocket in Majd al-Shams, a Druze village in the Golan, the leader of the Druze minority in Lebanon, instead of siding with these poor families of kids, took the side of Hezbollah, although they were from the same group. So it's very, very complicated. And even if we'll reach an agreement in Gaza, it will not bring back the security and stability to the northern borders.
You talked about the UN resolutions regarding Hezbollah's status there in the Lebanese government's authority, which has been consistently violated. But the day after tomorrow, the UN Security Council is scheduled to vote on a renewal of the mandate for UNIFIL, the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, which theoretically monitors the border, theoretically is responsible for allowing the Lebanese government to have control in the region, which it does not have. What purpose does UNIFIL serve? I realize that there is a preference, I believe, as I understand it, on the part of the Israeli military and political structure. It's better to have UNIFIL there than not have UNIFIL there. But what is it really doing? And are they in the way of a possibility of accomplishing the necessary objective of eliminating the Hezbollah threat right up to the border?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. If I'm looking at how UNIFIL was established originally, because there's a history to that and there is an original intention and where we are today. So originally, UNIFIL was established in 1978. And the idea was to put 2,000 soldiers in Lebanon and have some sort of a control on the stability in the regions, primarily on that border, because there were many actors on the border from both sides. There were Lebanese army, there was the Israeli army, there were different kinds of farmers that worked all the way close to the border fence. So the options for friction was quite there. And after the war in 2006, the war in Lebanon, after soldiers were kidnapped by Hezbollah, and Israel went to try and locate them in Lebanon, and one thing led to another. Very quickly, we found ourselves in 34 days of the war. The understanding after the war was that these 2,000 soldiers are not sufficient to such a complicated arena. And therefore, the number had been increased to 12,000. And that's 12, even a little bit more. And that's where we are today. This is the number more or less. And on the one hand, I will tell you, Jason, that it shows, I think, the commitment of the international community to the stability in this region, because many countries have sent soldiers to participate in this peacekeeping force. But on the other hand, and this is, I think, the challenge, is the mandate of UNIFIL limits their operational capacity. So on the one hand, when they were able to contain some kind of events from flaring up, let's say an argument between a shepherd, a Lebanese shepherd, and an Israeli farmer on the border. So they were able to contain that and, finish those kind of local kind of tits for tats. But on the other hand, I think that they were not an active enough force to prevent the attacks that we had from Lebanon to Israel. And since 2006, since that war, there were at least 20 different times in which Hezbollah or other attacks came from Lebanon to Israeli soil, and UNIFIL didn't do anything about it. So I think that a multinational force could be a critical element in serving as a stabilizing force. I'll give you only another positive example from UNIFIL. At the good years, the stable years, we had a trilateral meetings in the UNIFIL base in Nakura in Lebanon. There was the Israeli representative, the UNIFIL representative, and the Lebanese army representative. And this mechanism, which UNIFIL kind of coordinated, allowed to, on the one hand, exchange messages, and on the other hand, solve different issues. And we knew that every month this group is meeting. For years and years, it worked. But still, the situation is today so complicated in terms of the arms that Hezbollah has. So we need a different solution. We need a stronger force that will be a stabilizing force, but will also have a mandate that will allow it to really act on the ground.
Which I must tell you is what AJC has been pushing, but there's resistance in the Security Council, unfortunately. But we'll talk about that in another session, I hope. It's very frustrating. I mean, the idea of having an empowered UNIFIL that actually is able to exercise the authority that's given to it and the mandate would go a long way to providing some sort of stability on that border. Let me ask one last question, and then let's turn it over to our audience. The U.S. role. We talked about the possibility of a negotiation that the United States has been pursuing, but what about the role that the United States is playing in partnership with Israel in helping supply weapons that are necessary in the conduct of this campaign, but also, of course, the war that's going on in Gaza? The fact that there are 2 aircraft carrier groups, battle groups in the region, the fact that there's now a ballistic missile submarine that President Biden has dispatched, that there is a new jet fighter squadron that's been sent to the area, all with the intention of sending a very strong signal to Tehran. Don't, I think as President Biden said, don't. That was his message. Is it working? Does Israel feel more secure with the basis of this support that the United States is providing?
I think there's a huge admiration in Israel to the amount of support that the U.S. sent here. And you mentioned 2 aircraft carriers, but there is a lot more than that.
Yeah.
I can tell you that there are around 17 different types of vessels with different kind of capabilities which are here. And it's interesting that you're asking this question because a few hours ago, General Brown, the American Chief of Staff, gave an interview to Reuters. And by the way, guess where he gave the interview from? An aircraft carrier, one of those two you mentioned, just to show another message. And what he said, and this is very interesting, he said the US military was better positioned to aid in the defense of Israel and its own forces in the Middle East than it was on April 13, when Iran launched the attack. And this, of course, is relevant to the amount of aircraft carriers and others. Now, I do want to mention that, you know, aircraft carriers are very powerful, but the US also sent here F-22 squadrons. And this means a very big don't, because this is not a defense kind of tool. It could be defense, but it's usually for attacking reasons. So obviously, the amount of investment that the US put here in the region is very, very significant. Having said that, the estimation in Israel today is still that Iran will retaliate. And we heard in the last 24 hours, the Iranian Chief of Staff, the spokesperson of the Revolutionary Guards, and the president all repeat the same message of retaliation. I also understand, according to the sources I have, that the Houthis will also retaliate. The reason they haven't done so is due to very severe weather conditions in Yemen, which includes floods and heavy rain. So I do think there is deterrence for sure from the way the US has spread its forces here in the region. And this would maybe lead Iran to react in a more moderate way than they originally intended. So without a doubt, the US presence definitely has an influence on the players here. Not on all of them. The Houthis, as the general said, are a wild card. And I agree with him totally. But I do want to tell you that this has been covered widely in Israel, in all the media outlets, and I think there's a huge appreciation to the U.S. investment here in the region.
That's very good to hear. Okay, Daniel, let's entertain questions from our audience.
Thank you, Jason. Our first question from Jerry Schilling. Avital, do you think Hezbollah's strategy is to engage in a prolonged conflict with Israel to weaken it over time?
Interesting question. I don't think so, because if I'm looking at Hezbollah's interest, it doesn't really, I would say, resonate with its interest. Hezbollah wants to show itself as a resistance organization fighting for the cause of the Palestinians, but at a certain limit. They're not happy to pay in lives for Palestinians. They look at their own people as sacred in a way, and then the Shiite, of course, is above the others. However, once they got into this loop, they will need some serious reason to climb down the tree. And therefore, they have been repeating over and over again the message that then when there will be a ceasefire in Gaza, they will stop. Now, they're not using most of the arsenal. This is the second reason why I don't agree. They're not using most of their arsenal. They're using only the very not sophisticated rockets. They're not using all the types of drones they have. So in other words, they're showing presence. They're not, doing an exceptional kind of military acts, but they need to react after they made a whole kind of point about being the resistance organization. And also, don't forget, they have direct directions from Iran. And sometimes there is a conflict here, because sometimes Iran pushes them to do more, and Nasrallah does not necessarily want to do more. So there's also this kind of conflict as well. So the answer is no, they're not interested for a very lengthy kind of situation. By the way, every terror group would prefer to surprise the other side. And day by day, repeating the same kind of attacks to the same targets with the same kind of weapons does not really serve this goal.
Daniel?
Our next question from Cindy Malka. Recent developments between Israel and Hezbollah have raised fears of an all-out war. What specific factors or conditions might trigger a full-scale regional conflict? And then from Gary Singer, what role can some of the Arab states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, others, play in maintaining peace?
So first of all, I want to say that despite of the preemptive strike that Israel took a few days ago in a very successful way, we're still in the risk of a full-scale war. That risk has not evaporated. And I'll give you an example. What could trigger something like that? Let's say that Hezbollah decides to hit a military base in a neighborhood. Let's say it's in Haifa. And they're not using the most advanced weapons, as I said before. And Hezbollah has a misfiring proportion of something like 15%. So let's say they fire 70 rockets to the base, and 5 rockets don't land in the base, but hit a building in the neighborhood, in the residential neighborhood nearby. And as a result of that, 20 Israelis are being killed, civilians. You can imagine that Israel will not stand by and just, let its people be killed. And obviously, Israel will retaliate in a harsh way. And then there will be another harsh Hezbollah response in retaliation. And in this kind of situation, we can find ourselves very quickly escalating into the slippery slope into a full-scale war. Because as I said in the beginning, this is not the only front that we are holding at this point of time. Imagine a situation with holding a lot of balls in the air. So you have Lebanon, you have Syria, you have Iraq, which are firing from time to time. Plus, there are a lot of different Iranian militias, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, really dozens of them with different training, different capabilities. We'll leave out the names, but there are really dozens of them. And you have the Houthis in Yemen as well, and you have Iran, and you still have Gaza going on, and that will not be over for a long time. So the situation is that it could definitely lead to a full-scale war. One of these attacks could definitely deteriorate, and this is something that is definitely being taken into consideration. And I haven't mentioned that even in the West Bank, there are still events that always take place almost on a daily basis, whether it's a terrorist attempt, because Hamas is also very dominant in some of the areas in the West Bank, and a lot of terror activities there, a lot of incitement. So the Israeli Defense Forces are also invested there. And at the end of the day, Israel is a small country, and it needs to maintain its capabilities, and it can't, spread its forces endlessly. We're limited at the end of the day. Now, as for the second question, look, the Abraham Accords, which Israel signed almost 4 years ago with the Emirates and with Bahrain, is of strategic nature. It's a strategic interest of both countries to keep and maintain these relations. And that's the reason, for example, that flights from Dubai to Israel never stopped after October 7, while American airlines, different American airlines, stopped flying here for 7 months. The Emirati airlines did not, for example. And the trade continued, of course, different scales, and the relations continued. So yes, this is a complicated situation, and of course, it requires careful management, careful diplomacy, but this is a strategic interest. And I have no doubt that the Israeli leadership is interested in expanding the Abraham Accords to additional moderate countries in the region. Of course, I don't see it happening tomorrow morning, but it will happen. And when it will happen, and this is my little ray of optimism here, I think we'll see a different Middle East than what we have known and seen for many, many decades.
Well, thank you, Avital. And needless to say, this is a project that AJC has been pursuing for decades as well, in partnership with you and other colleagues of ours. Daniel, perhaps one last question?
Sure. We have a question from Susie Jaffe. Are military targets likely to be the focus of both Iran and Hezbollah in any type of retaliation? And if so, will Israel put their planes in the air again as they did in April?
So with Iran, it's a bit more complicated. It could be military, it could be civilian, but it could also be a civilian target which represents a government official, for example, because Hania was civilian, but he was also an official in the sense that he was the head of the political bureau of Hamas. I do think, and I do understand from my sources, Susie, that Iran is not interested at this point of time to create some sort of a huge kind of retaliation that would lead to a full-scale war. That is still the situation. And also, keep in mind that on April 14, when Iran launched here ballistic missiles and drones and other rockets, it failed. It was a huge failure. And it was a huge buildup before, and it was a failure. So they could not afford to lose once again. So when they will react, I'm sure it will be a very kind of creative target on the one hand, but on the other hand, it would be such a target that will not lead into a full-scale war here. And again, at this point of time in Israel, there is an understanding that Iran may still retaliate.
I would like to end on a better note than that, Avital, but that's the reality. That's the reality that we're facing, that you especially are facing, and all Israelis are facing. I think also we can remind ourselves of the good news that we began this conversation with, of the rescue of one hostage. But we know that difficulties lie ahead. Tensions are continuing to rise, and hostages are still being held by Hamas in Gaza. But we will stay in touch with you, and we will look forward to further updates as the war continues and as Israel continues to find ways to establish a better future for itself and for the region. Daniel?
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Avital, for today's AJC Advocacy Anywhere program. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in. As a reminder to stay up to date on the evolving situation, in addition to these Advocacy Anywhere programs, make sure to follow AJC on social media at AJC Global. You can find more resources and ways to take action at ajc.org/Hezbollah or ajc.org/Israel-Hamas war. We're very regularly adding new materials and updates, including a very helpful explainer of Hezbollah. Our hearts are in Israel today and every day. Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you again.
Thank you.